The story begins with a single breathtaking image, a city carved into living stone that seems to grow out of the desert itself. Petra grabs attention because it is impossible to forget when you have seen its rose-red facades lit by a low sun. This opening image is not just spectacle, but a mystery of power, ingenuity, and survival that demands explanation. By following trade, water, and politics, we can understand how a so-called desert people built a kingdom and a cultural legacy. To understand the Nabataeans, we must begin in the desert, where survival shapes every decision a people make. The Arabian desert is not a blank wasteland, but a landscape of routes, oases, and seasonal possibilities that merchants could exploit with skill and risk tolerance. The Nabataeans emerged in this context as mobile traders and opportunistic settlers who learned to read the rhythm of wind, rock, and water. Their success depended on turning scarcity into leverage, controlling what others needed, and moving goods across vast empty spaces. Their origins are partly obscure because the Nabataeans left few monumental written histories to boast about conquest or kingship. Archaeology and classical sources instead show a people who grew from nomadic roots into urban centers through trade and diplomacy over centuries. Trade networks centered on incense and aromatics provided the capital and incentive needed for urbanization, and settlement patterns shifted to exploit favorable terrains and defensive positions. Petra became the logical culmination of such a trajectory. A capital located where geography and commerce intersected. Control of long-distance trade is the simplest explanation for Nabataean wealth, and incense was the gasoline of the ancient economy. Frankincense and myrrh were so valuable that they were worth more than many metals, and the routes from southern Arabia to Mediterranean markets were lifelines of commerce. Nabataean caravans loaded with resin, spices, and luxury goods crisscrossed the Arabian corridors, and taxation and tolls at choke points turned mobility into revenue. The ability to protect caravans and negotiate safe passage became an instrument of statecraft as much as it was a business model. Petra was more than a city. It was a living ledger of trade, a hub where merchants met, stored goods, and settled contracts. The rock-cut architecture of Petra acted like a bank, a storehouse, and a public face that projected wealth and legitimacy to traders and rivals alike. The facades carved into cliffs functioned as both monuments and advertisements, promising protection and prosperity for those who traded there. The monumental scale communicated a political message. This people could command labor, water, and art on an imperial level. Carving a city out of stone required not only artistic vision, but precise engineering and logistics. The Nabataeans demonstrated exceptional skill in planning, quarrying, scaffolding, and chiseling to create symmetrical facades on vertical rock faces that endured for millennia. These constructions were not simply decorative. They were integrated with functional spaces like tombs, storage rooms, and ritual chambers that supported urban life. The labor, craft specialization, and resource allocation underlying these projects reveal a sophisticated political economy. What truly made Petra habitable was water, and the Nabataeans mastered desert hydraulics in ways that rivaled other ancient civilizations. They built cisterns, channels, and dams that captured flash floods and stored water to support agriculture, livestock, and large urban populations. Their water systems turned seasonal storms into predictable resources, and these infrastructures were a form of public goods that reinforced the authority of Nabataean rulers. The engineering solutions allowed Petra to flourish where others would have failed, turning scarcity into stability. The landscape around Petra was transformed by hydraulic ingenuity that included terraced gardens and runoff control structures. These terraces held soil and moisture, enabling olive trees, vines, and grains to grow in an otherwise hostile environment. This agricultural output sustained urban populations and produced surplus goods that could be traded or taxed, creating a virtuous cycle between engineering and economic capacity. The agricultural terraces also served as a visible proof of effective governance and long-term planning. Religion and ritual gave the Nabataeans a shared identity that bound diverse trading communities together. Temples, shrines, and tomb rituals blended local Arabian deities with Hellenistic influences, producing a syncretic pantheon unique to the region. Public religious spaces in Petra served civic as well as sacred functions, hosting festivals and gatherings that reinforced social cohesion. The funerary architecture, richly decorated and often monumental, linked the living with the lineage of elite families that managed trade and water rights. Burials and tomb facades were especially important because they were public statements about identity and power in Nabataean society. Elaborate tombs announced lineage and legitimacy, and functioned as both memorial and economic asset for families that controlled trade networks. The sculptures, inscriptions, and grave goods reveal cultural syncretism, with influences from Greek, Egyptian, and Arabian artistic vocabularies. These funerary practices also show how elites invested wealth produced by trade into monuments that would outlast political fragility. Language and script provide another thread connecting the Nabataeans to later Arabian culture, because their script evolved from Aramaic and gradually influenced early Arabic writing. The Nabataean script was a living, adaptive writing system used in administration, commerce, and monumental inscriptions across the kingdom. Scholars trace how the cursive Nabataean form simplified over time and contributed shapes that reappeared in the nascent Arabic script. This linguistic evolution reminds us that cultural transmission often occurs through mundane instruments like letters, contracts, and graffiti. Material culture also moved along the same routes as language and pottery, jewelry, and textiles found at Petra show a cosmopolitan mixture of styles. Merchants brought fashions, religious objects, and technologies that the Nabataeans adapted into their own cultural vocabulary. This cultural permeability made Petra both familiar and foreign to visitors from Rome, Egypt, and Arabia, allowing Nabataean elites to negotiate identities strategically. The result was a hybrid urban culture that functioned extraordinarily well as a commercial crossroads. The incense trade itself required complex logistics and diplomacy, because frankincense and myrrh had to reach markets across deserts and seas. Nabataean control over key caravan routes allowed them to extract economic rent by protecting trade as it moved from southern Arabia toward Mediterranean ports. They did not monopolize everything by force, but rather constructed networks of alliances, toll stations, and market towns that funneled wealth through Petra. That economic leverage translated into political autonomy and regional influence during the late Hellenistic and early Roman eras. Petra's urban planning was shaped by the needs of merchants, with storage areas, marketplaces, and administrative centers integrated into the rock-cut city. Public spaces functioned as nodes for information exchange, contract making, and dispute resolution among diverse merchant communities. The city's layout promoted surveillance and security as much as commerce, with narrow canyons acting as natural choke points and grand faades projecting authority. This architecture facilitated centralized governance of trade without necessarily requiring a large standing army. Outside of Petra, the Nabataeans established a network of fortified way stations and smaller urban centers that secured trade corridors. These outposts served as customs points, supply depots, and rest stops where caravans could replenish and negotiate terms of passage. By investing in infrastructure across a wide region, Nabataean rulers decentralized certain functions while reinforcing an integrated economic system centered on Petra. Those investments created resilience by distributing risk across geography, rather than concentrating it in a single node. Relations with neighboring powers were a constant balancing act because wealth attracts attention, and the Nabataeans had to negotiate with empires larger than themselves. Hellenistic kingdoms, the Hasmonean state, and later Rome all engaged with Petra through diplomacy, trade agreements, and sometimes military pressure. The Nabataeans used marriage alliances, tribute, and strategic concessions to maintain autonomy for as long as possible. These political maneuvers reveal how small but wealthy states survive by being flexible, shrewd, and sometimes willing to pay for peace. Roman interest in Nabatea grew as the empire expanded eastward and sought control of lucrative trade and regional stability. Rome pursued a mixture of cooperation and coercion, trading status for access, and sometimes using military force to secure its interests. In 106 CE, the Roman Empire formally annexed the Nabataean Kingdom, integrating Petra into the provincial system while preserving some local elites and practices. The absorption demonstrates the limits of regional autonomy when great powers decide to secure supply lines and borders. Roman annexation changed trade patterns and administrative structures, and over time it reduced Petra's centrality in the incense economy. Maritime routes and new political priorities favored ports over caravan hubs, causing economic shifts that undermined Petra's dominance. Additionally, natural factors like changes in climate and seismic activity affected the viability of long-distance desert trade. The combination of political reorientation and environmental pressures contributed to a gradual decline of urban life in Petra. The decline of Petra did not erase Nabataean cultural influence because language, art, and technical knowledge radiated outward into the Arabian Peninsula. The script that evolved in Nabatea seeded forms that later appeared in Arabic writing, linking past and future through script evolution. Material practices like water management and caravan logistics continued to inform regional practices for centuries. Cultural transmission is often gradual and subtle, and the Nabataean imprint is visible in unexpected places like agricultural techniques and administrative habits. Archaeology in the modern era reawakened the world to Petra's grandeur and Nabataean achievements, transforming a forgotten city into a global symbol of ancient ingenuity. Explorers, scholars, and local communities have since reconstructed parts of the narrative through excavation and preservation work. This rediscovery created new economies and controversies around tourism, heritage management, and national identity in Jordan and neighboring states. Petra today sits at the intersection of ancient legacy and modern geopolitics, a living monument with contemporary implications. Tourism has made Petra an icon, but also a fragile resource that requires careful stewardship and community involvement. Balancing preservation with economic opportunity is a modern challenge that echoes ancient dilemmas about resource allocation and public goods. Local communities play a critical role in sustaining Petra, and their livelihoods now depend on managing visitors while protecting the site. The dialogue between heritage conservation and economic development is a continuation of the Nabataean pattern of leveraging place for prosperity. Beyond Petra, Nabataean techniques spread across Arabia and North Africa, influencing everything from masonry to urban planning. Their experience shows how practical knowledge can migrate with people and goods, shaping landscapes in ways that outlast political entities. The legacy of turning scarce resources into organized systems is perhaps the most enduring lesson from Nabataea for modern societies facing environmental constraints. Their history invites reflection on how humans can adapt to difficult ecologies with creativity and cooperation. There is a psychological dimension to the Nabataean story because their monuments serve to shape collective memory and identity among diverse inhabitants. Public architecture acts as a narrative device, telling inhabitants and visitors who belongs and who wields authority over resources. The ebb and flow of Petra's fortune also teach a moral about impermanence and adaptation, showing how prosperity can be built and eroded by both human choices and natural forces. That awareness can inform modern policy choices about infrastructure, trade, and cultural memory. If we return to the incense trade, we find an economic logic that resonates with modern commodity flows and geopolitical choke points. Control of a product that others urgently desired created leverage that could be converted into political and cultural capital. The Nabataeans remind us that geography and demand can produce concentrated power even without imperial armies. Their story complicates simplistic notions of state formation and highlights the many ways societies generate influence. Ultimately, the Roman conquest was neither an abrupt erasure nor a neat conclusion to Nabataea's story, because influences continued to intermix after annexation. Local elites adapted to Roman rule, while elements of Nabataean culture persisted in everyday life and regional institutions. Rather than viewing conquest as total obliteration, we should see it as one turn in a longer process of cultural entanglement. Petra's stones still carry inscriptions and designs that speak to multiple voices layered over centuries. Today, the Nabataean legacy is visible not only in stone, but also in language, urban practice, and regional identities across the Arabian world. Archaeologists and historians continue to refine the story, revealing more about governance, trade networks, and daily life than earlier sources allowed. The power of the Nabataeans lay in their adaptability and ability to turn the desert into a conduit of connections. That capacity to rework landscapes and institutions for new circumstances remains relevant in a world facing climate stress and shifting trade systems. There is also a symbolic lesson in Petra's scale and fragility, because monuments memorialize both achievement and vulnerability. Massive façades carved from sandstone look timeless until the slow processes of erosion and human impact reveal their mortality. Preservation thus becomes an ethical act that connects present communities to past ingenuity while acknowledging limits. Efforts to protect Petra are efforts to preserve a human story about innovation, exchange, and adaptation across harsh environments. Thinking about the Nabataeans also reframes how we imagine the desert, not as empty wilderness, but as a landscape rich in opportunity and networks. Petra was a hub created by human attention and investment, and its existence challenges stereotypes about marginal places. This reframing encourages us to look for other histories hidden in marginal landscapes and to value the adaptive strategies that made human life possible in difficult climates. The Nabataeans offer a hopeful template for making livable spaces under constraint. The final thought is a philosophical twist. Power comes not only from armies or territory, but from the ability to connect, to make things move, and to shape dependence. The Nabataeans mastered connections, water, trade, and culture, and used them to create a kingdom out of scarcity. Their history is a reminder that human ingenuity often arises from constraint, and that civic ingenuity can endure in unexpected ways. If tonight you think of Petra, imagine it as a ledger of connections etched in rock, not simply as a majestic ruin. If this video gave you a new perspective on how deserts became empires, then the story has done its job. The Nabataeans teach us to read landscapes as archives of human choice, and to see monuments as lessons about governance, economy, and adaptation. If this perspective resonated, hit subscribe to follow more videos that explore how forgotten places shaped the modern world. Thank you for watching. And remember that history often hides in the most unexpected corners of the map.